Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Today we want to look at issues of the research gap, the type of research gaps that you can articulate in your studies, and see how your research is going to work out. So when we look at this, we first need to have an understanding of what a gap is all about. So today we are talking about the research gap, what it is, how to identify it, the taxonomy of the research gaps, or the types of the gaps that could be available in literature, and how to make use of those gaps so that you can pursue innovative research, or so that your research, when you at least you present it to your panel, people will be able to say, okay, you have something that is worth noting, or you have something that we can research on. I know in a number of times, you people would have felt that they have discovered a new and exciting research question, only to find that it has already been written about. I have personally experienced this many times, that I can actually count. So it's important that people actually get a skill in terms of knowing the gap and knowing how to position it, as well as knowing how to position their research, in positioning their research into context. That is very important to do. So graduate studies often they come with pressure to add to new knowledge, and that's the reason why when students present their proposals, defend their work, people will still ask you about so what. People will still ask you what is new about this study, what is novel about this particular study. People are concerned about the novelty of the study. They are concerned about you adding to new knowledge, because that's the nature of the game. We are doing research in order to contribute to new knowledge. So we do research to do contribution to new knowledge. We do research in order to contribute to progress, to improve practice, to improve the knowledge of humanity, the knowledge in our area, and all those kind of stuff. So for us to do this, we need first to learn how to identify the gap. So if you are not in a position to identify the gap, then it becomes quite difficult for you to do any kind of research in your area and all those kind of things. So it's important that we understand that, and we have a pressure to add to new knowledge in the process. So when you look at this, when we are building research, research is built up on the issue of the research gap. So if you don't have a gap, you cannot pursue research. If you don't have a gap, you cannot conduct research. So most of the research work that we do, or most of the research work that you should be doing, it must be linked to a gap. You must be able to develop a gap in the process. So if you can't identify one, then in other words, you cannot do research. So the gap is the primary basis for you doing an investigation in whatever field you are working on. So you need to have a gap for you to conduct research. You need to have a gap for you to investigate any problem, any phenomena, or any scientific question. So given this accepted tenet, given this accepted tenet, you would find out that researchers are not trained on how to systematically identify research gaps. And I think most of the times you guys have done research methodology to just pass it, get a grade, forgetting that research is an applied subject. Research is an applied course. People really need to learn how to do this stuff and all those kind of things. So you are not normally trained to systematically identify gaps. And I hope at the end of this session, you would get some kind of help that helps you to identify research gaps, because this forms the basis of your investigation. So you would find out that most novice researchers, or people who are doing masters for the first time, people who pass through masters, and at masters they never cared to do proper research and are now doing their doctoral studies. This is a common problem that you tend to find in the process, and this is the problem we are trying to deal with today, and see how we can do. So unfailingly, very little theory and research has actually been developed on identifying research gaps. I leave this time maybe to Dr. Mari to say one or two issues as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woyo. I'm sorry for coming a bit late, but I think we need to emphasize the point that certainly finding a research gap is the crux of actually doing research. And I think, as you have rightly pointed out, there is no training that one is going to get in terms of how you can go about doing it. It's like for us in journalism, we say that you need to develop what we call a nose for news so that you'll be able to write news. If you are not able to develop that nose for news, it's likely that you may go out into the field and come back without any news to report on. So it's the same as actually doing and finding a research gap. It's something that you have to develop. It's something that you have to inculcate in yourself based on your wide readership of literature, but also just being able to understand the particular field that you are dealing with. What are the emerging issues? What are the spaces where research is not yet really been done? And what can I do to actually be able to deal with that kind of a scenario where there is little information on a particular research area that you are probably interested in? So it's pretty much related to those issues. That's what I would say for now. You can move on, Dr. Way.
Sorry. You want to speak to this?
No, it's fine. You can do that. I can just come in and then I'll add the flash.
Oh, okay. So when it comes to the issue of the research gap, when it comes to the issue of the research gap, finding gaps is problematic for many researchers, including even those that have passed their PhDs or masters. Just the skill of getting to know what is my research gap is quite problematic. So why it becomes problematic, I said it earlier on, that there is actually no formal frameworks that you can find in terms of identifying and characterizing these gaps. And when we look at the gaps, these gaps are actually seen to be in the eye of the beholder. One researcher's gap may be another researcher's SNAN gap and all those kind of stuff. And then in that kind of scenario, it becomes quite difficult because you really need to convince me that you have a gap, because I might not see it that way. So there is this conflict around research gaps that we normally treat around in terms of perception. So it remains a struggle, especially for most researchers, particularly among doctoral students and master's students, to identify and define what their gap is. So in most of the times one has to read the whole introduction and background section of the paper, and you can come to the end, and after reading up to the end, you still struggle to find out, okay, I have finished reading this, but what is this gap that this particular researcher is trying to address? So it's quite important that we know all this kind of stuff, and then we do that. So moving on to the types, there are quite a number of issues that can come into play here. There has been some frameworks that are beginning to come through, one done by Robinson et al. 2011, and in their model, they described around 5 types of research gaps, in which case they talk about issues around population, issues around intervention, issues around comparison, issues around the outcomes. Those were their early issues around the research gap, in terms of how it can come out. So it's about population, intervention, comparison, outcomes, and settings. And for you to get this message across, you should be able to read. Then another second taxonomy, or another second model that have tried to classify these issues, is the one done by Muller, Bloch, and Crancy. They actually improved on the work that was done by Robinson, and they identified these particular gaps, and these are the gaps that we want to spend most of our time focusing on, where you talk about your contradictory evidence gap, your knowledge void gap, your action knowledge conflict gap, your methodological gap, your evaluation void gap, your theory application void gap. So, and more recently, Miles 2017 proposed a new model built around the 2 previous models, talking about these kind of gaps. So we want to focus our discussion on these gaps that we are talking about. Dr. Murray?
Yes, so essentially, it's very important that we look at some of these typologies of research gaps and try and understand how, for example, the evidence-based gap can actually be used. For example, we also want to look at the knowledge gap. So in terms of when you look at the evidence gap, essentially it occurs when something that is provocative actually arose or arises, that allows you to find, forces you actually to do and find new research that contradicts what is actually widely accepted. For example, let's say we are talking about COVID-19, and everyone pretty much, speaks around maybe the causes, being linked to seafood and all these things. But if somebody comes with something that is really contradictory to this established knowledge and established conclusions, that creates what we would call an evidence gap, because this gap involves contradictions that are already inherent in findings that have already been done by others before you. So actually, you can actually use this evidence gap typology actually to analyze what is it that is already out there, what is actually seen as common sense knowledge in your field, and what is it that is actually coming up in terms of things that can actually contradict that. And when you are able to look at the contradictory evidence that speaks against established norms, then that's when you can be able to demonstrate that you have an understanding of what an evidence gap is in your particular research. We can also talk about the knowledge gap. This is pretty much a common gap in the prior research knowledge that is already there. There are 2 settings where the knowledge gap or the knowledge void might occur. The first one is when we are saying knowledge may not exist in the actual field in terms of theories or even literature. Or second, it might be the case that the result of a study differs from what is actually expected. So it's at 2 levels where you can actually say, okay, there's actually nothing that exists in terms of understanding this particular field that I'm dealing with. And therefore, that's why I have done this particular research, or that's why I'm interested in actually focusing on this particular issue that I want to look at. So you can use these two two scenarios actually to see whether you can actually be able to add more information in terms of what actually exists, or in terms of actually raising issues that contradict that what is already also expected in your particular area of expertise. You can take over, Dr. Will, or just add something there.
Thank you very much. Let me just move to the next one. So we also have the practical knowledge gap. Under this kind of gap, this kind of gap tends to be a discrepancy that can motivate new research in a new direction altogether. So a practical knowledge gap or action knowledge conflict, it's a situation that arises when the actual behavior of professionals is different from their advocated behavior. So when you spot this kind of mismatch, then people might need to now find out, well, why is it like this? Why do we have the behavior of professionals in this kind of direction when it is actually advocated that they should be doing something like this? So in this case, research could actually seek to determine the scope of the conflict and try to uncover the reasons for existence and all those kind of stuff. I can tell you that one of the things at the moment is, even if you look at issues around COVID-19 at the moment, you would find out that people are still traveling, but they're still traveling even into areas where it is very bad. And then it's a mismatch, because practically, given the stigma around it and the way COVID-19 is ravaging things, people should actually stay at home. So if you find out people wanting to go and still visit COVID whatever destinations, it becomes quite important for people to try and understand what is motivating that kind of actual behavior in that kind of space. Or you seeing people like Dr. Mari, who work in media, going to Syria and still trying to cover some news, when it's normal or practically impossible for you to just think about going to that particular country. Then the fourth one is the issue around issues of methodology as a gap. So a methodological gap is the type of gap that deals with the conflict that occurs due to the influence of methodology on the research results. So this particular gap in this instance, it addresses the conflicts with your research methods in prior studies and offers a new line of research that is quite divergent from previous research methods and all those kind of stuff. So you might find out that there are some issues that could have been dominated by quantitative research, but those quantitative research might not be giving probably new insights into what is really happening. For instance, you might want to find out, like, if people are to still travel when COVID-19 is still around, when literature has shown that people have got risk attitudes, for instance, they choose destinations because of this and that, you might need now to see what kind of methodology has been used in previous studies. And if you are to do something new and get new insights, you might need now to think about a new way of collecting data, a new way of doing other things in order for you to solve this. So people should always be looking out on methodological gaps. When you look at your study, what is the dominant methodology? What is the dominant method of data collection? What is the dominant method of data analysis? And all those kind of stuff. And is there a way of trying to analyze data differently? Is there a way of trying to collect data differently and get a new different sets of information and all those kind of stuff? So it is noted that it might be useful to vary research methods in the same discipline with the same construct in order to see how it is going to come through. So it is noted it might be useful for you to vary your research methodology or your research methods, and try to see how things work, especially if certain research topics have actually been explored using a singular or a common method. So in your discipline, it's your responsibility as a researcher to try and find out what is the dominant methodology that has been used in your study, and try to see what gaps exist over that, Dr. Murray.
Yes, so essentially, I just want to echo what you've just pointed out. So, a gap can also be found at the level of what we call practical knowledge gap, where pretty much it's about, looking at what actually is in operation at that point in time. And actually the conflict that arises when the actual behavior of professionals is different from the one that is actually advocated. You can actually talk about, how does theory, theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge actually have contradictions. And when you look at that, you can actually be able to find, research gaps there. But also even at the methodological level, as you have pointed out, there are so many studies that you can read, and you can actually see that most of the researchers are pretty much following a certain, methodological route. For example, in our field, it could be qualitative, or it could also be more of the quantitative. So, you can actually see a gap where you're saying, okay, most of the studies have actually been using this particular methodological route. If I use another methodological route, I can actually be able to add more knowledge, because certainly there are certain nuances that come with actually using a different method from the one that has been used by others when you're looking at a particular phenomenon. So that can also create a research gap for yourself, where you are pretty much looking only targeting mostly the methods or the research strategies or instruments that were used by different scholars before you. That's what you can actually follow up and then look at that and then say, how do you justify doing your study at that point in time using that particular method? That's what I would say. You can take over, Dr. Oil.
Okay. Thank you for that particular contribution. Maybe you can speak to this quickly, as I'm trying to attend to some small issue.
Okay, thanks. So the other issue that you also need to be mindful of is what we call the empirical gap. The empirical gap is the gap that arises when you're dealing with knowledge that is actually not available in a particular field. So, for example, right now there's little empirical knowledge around the phenomenon of COVID-19. That's why probably you are seeing all kinds of scientists doing all kinds of researches in trying to get the drug to cure COVID-19. So already in terms of the level of empiricism or empirical data that we can actually use that has been verified based on research, there is really nothing out there. So that's why people are, there are so many funded research right now around that. And also even there's no precedence even in history in terms of dealing with this kind of magnitude. Of course, we have had other, SARS, the Spanish flu and other, but this one comes with its own novelty because of the way how things have also evolved over time. So at the level of empirical, you can empirical level, you can actually be able to find a gap that actually addresses conflicts that no study to date has actually been able to evaluate or even to come up with. So if there's a new phenomenon that is there, no one has ever done that research. Or for example, right now we are talking about the impact of, for example, of flexible working arrangements. Probably in a COVID-19 situation, there could have been studies before around flexible working conditions, but there is no particular study that is focused on a context in which people actually are constrained in terms of mobility. People cannot move from one city to the other. So you can actually do an empirical study around that so that you can be able to understand that. So that kind of a study, we will call it an empirical, because there is no, there are no findings that are already in existence that can speak to that particular area that you are trying to look at. So you can actually say that. And then the other one is what we call the theoretical gap. The theoretical gap is where pretty much you find that there is in your field, there are certain theories that have not been applied, or even a conceptual framework that have not been applied to understand a particular phenomenon. So you can then be able to bring, maybe even borrow theoretical frameworks from other fields or disciplines and bring it into your own study. When you try and do that, you can actually be able to create what we call, try and fill what we call a theoretical gap. So there are various ways in which you can actually be able to deal with some of these issues, but it's about demonstrating to your reader which gap are you dealing with. Are you dealing are you looking at a research gap at the level of empiricism, empirical, or is it at the level of evidence? Is it at the level of practical knowledge? Is it at the level of methodology? Is it at the level of theory? You must be clear. You must be able to articulate that quite clearly to your reader so that they can be able to understand where are you coming from in terms of what you are trying to achieve through your study.
Thank you for that. And then probably the last one we are talking about here is the issue of the population gap. So when we talk about population gap, it's quite a common gap that should be recognized by researchers. There are always underserved populations that have always been under-researched and all those kind of stuff. So it's quite important for people to know this particular gap and see. So for instance, you might find out that when you look at your research or your research area, which gender has actually been dominating the focus of the study? Is it the female gender? Is it the male gender? Which race? Which ethnicity? Which age? And all those kind of information. So it becomes very, very, very important to know this gap regarding the population and try to find out which studies or which gap is probably underrepresented, and then you try to do research with that particular population. If the females are underrepresented in existing research, so your research gap in terms of population-wise should be focusing on females. I am seeing quite a number of research these days that are gendered around female, trying to find out issues using the gender maybe as a moderating or a mediating variable in terms of, let's say, ICT adoption or any other issue that you might want to do. So it's important to find out in terms of the majority of the studies that are being done, which gender dominates the discussion, which race dominates the discussion, which age dominates the discussion, which level of education dominates the discussion, especially more of the things around people thinking that you just have to drop out of school to become a successful entrepreneur. There's a population gap. Are we also saying that educated people cannot become successful entrepreneur and all those kind of stuff? I don't know if Dr. Barry wants to add on this population gap, or we move to how we
let me
then
just add one or two things in terms of the population gap. I think it's very important because most of the time we tend to, like now, most of the studies that we tend to do are pretty much urban-centric, or they are done in urban areas. Most of the studies, like right now, so many people are doing studies on, the Namibia Airports Company. People are doing studies on, NamPower. So it's pretty much the same people that have been researched over and over again. It's even worse in Namibia, where it's a very small country. So you tend to see that if you look at the case studies that people often use, it's the same case studies that have been used by other people before. So in terms of population gap, it's about looking at other spaces or other people that have not been actually been taken into consideration. For example, people that live in rural areas, for example, they are under-researched in most cases, or even women in some cases, and even youth in some cases are under-researched. So those are spaces where you can actually look at and say, I want to focus on this particular group because they have not been sufficiently researched in this particular area that I'm looking at. You can move on to the next slide, Dr. Watt.
Thank you, Dave. So in terms of now trying to practicalize this, how then do you write an evidence, knowledge, or practical gaps for instance? So if you are to write an evidence gap, you would say the researcher identified an evidence gap in prior research concerning that, right? Previous research has addressed several aspects of this and that, and you try to cite 2 relevant articles, preferably articles that are quite recent, or probably articles that show the trend in which things were done. Then you try to cite 2 or 3 will become important. So you need to show that previous research has addressed several aspects of, let's say, customer loyalty, then you cite service recovery, then you cite service failure, then you cite those kind of constructs, the 3 of them that I have mentioned. Then in trying to show that now this is how we should proceed, you then need to articulate that, however, previous research has not addressed the several contradictions. Previous research has not addressed the several contradictions in the findings concerning prior research. So in as much as research has been done, but still maybe the results are inconclusive, and previous research has not concluded on that particular matter. And you need to know that, for you to know that there are contradictions, it means someone has read, has actually done some good literature review, some good background research. So it's important to know that as you highlight your evidence gap. So previous research has not addressed several contradictions in the findings concerning prior research. The researcher has identified that there is a gap, or there's an evidence gap in prior studies, according to the prior studies that are actually contradictory. So it's your responsibility to show this kind of evidence gap and try to link it with past studies, and try to show how do we move from just past studies and move to contradictions, and then you should be presenting your gap. And the same should also happen when you are talking about your knowledge gap. We are saying now the researcher has identified a knowledge gap in previous research concerning customer satisfaction, or concerning employee motivation, for instance. So in addition to research that was done in the past, or in addition, previous research did not address the subject of. So when we are talking now about the subject of, this is where your topic comes in, because you would have said there is a knowledge gap in previous research. And when we talk about this knowledge gap, you should now come immediately and put your study into context and say, in previous research did not address the subject of service failure and customer loyalty in a certain sector. This encompasses several unexplored dimensions that lately have attracted research attention in other disciplines. Then you try to cite literature there, and all those kind of stuff. And then when you put across your practical knowledge gap, you would need to say there is lack of rigorous research in prior literature. For you to arrive at these, it means one should have read, for you to know that there is actually lack of rigorous research in previous studies. Some of these unexplored issues is what could be the travel behavior for people in a post-COVID world. Are really people going to like traveling using the aircrafts or using their cars? Because this is just an unexplored situation that you need to show in and try to write that. So you would now say some of these unexplored issues around travel behavior appear to be lacking in the practice of your particular field. The field of travel behavior is ripe for an investigation of practical focus on travel behavior post-COVID. Many of the prior studies on theoretical aspects in the field of travel behavior, for instance, focused on all this kind of stuff. However, there are few practical studies or action research in the field of, and this is an important and worth of investigation in the context of An investigation of these issues is important because of further previous theoretical research has focused primarily on, and very little practical research has been done on. So when you are writing the last sentence there, you would now need to say, well, what was the focus of previous research? So if it focused on service failure and customer loyalty in airlines, and very little practical research has been done on service failure in a school context or something like that, that becomes it. So these are some simple ways of how do we present that. I have one or two of our papers that we're going to beam out there and show you, or perhaps ask you what kind of gap was being presented and how did you identify one, Dr. Murray?
Yes, I think you've rightly pointed out what I wanted to say. So I think you can move on to the next slide so that we can quickly finish and then maybe attend to questions that may arise.
Okay, so you can take through this one.
Okay, so again, we have already pointed out that there's also what we call the methodological gap. So again, in terms of writing this particular gap, obviously you can say the researcher identified the methodological gap in the prior research. There is a lack of A, B, C, D in terms of research design. Maybe you've identified, maybe it's qualitative or maybe it's quantitative designs in whatever field that you are. So based on the research we are trying to implement as a research design, we found that there is a depth in the prior research on that particular. So there are many ways of actually, raising these kinds of issues. Or you can actually say, in this study, we seek to establish a new inquiry on research designs with A, B, C, D, and then you tell us what exactly you are trying to do. Or you can also say, we seek to extend maybe, the methodological, methodological ways of doing things by addressing the following gaps that have arisen in terms of research that tend to use maybe quantitative or qualitative research methodologies. So it's up to you to see, based on your reading of literature, what is it that is coming out of literature that allows you to make those informed claims why you are justifying that particular study. Or you can also do it at the level of the empirical gap, as we've already pointed out, where you are saying there appears to be an empirical gap in the prior research. There is a lack of rigorous research in the prior literature. Some of the unexplored issues are as follows, and therefore you want to look at them because they have not been looked at. Or you can also write it as follows: an empirical investigation of these issues is important because of A, B, C, D. Then tell us the practical relevance or the policy implications of actually doing that empirical investigation so that you can add to knowledge or to try and solve a particular problem that is actually obtaining in a particular environment. Or you can also say, furthermore, previous research is focused primarily on qualitative research concerning maybe, for example, flexible working conditions or flexible working regimes that have tended to be pretty much based on qualitative studies. And therefore, I want to do a study that tries to use the quantitative approach or methodological approach to be able to understand what is really happening with regards to flexible working arrangements in the context of COVID-19. So there are many ways of doing it, but at the end of the day, it must be informed by your thorough reading of literature rather than just you thinking that I want to say I am dealing with an empirical gap or I'm trying to fill a methodological gap. That must be very evident based on your reading of literature. That's what I would say. You can take over, Dr. Woy.
Thank you for that. Then maybe when you are trying to write a theoretical and population gap, so you would need to say the researcher identified a theoretical gap in prior research concerning that. You put your key constructs there. Theory on your key construct is rather dated, and current studies bear the fruit of this theoretical gap. Some prior theory might appear to be important and a foundation worth of recognition. However, an investigation in terms of which is your current constructs and theoretical development is required or is warranted. An investigation of these issues is important because you try to justify why do we need to know more about what you are writing about? What do we stand to lose if we don't do research? Does it increase the way we come? Does it help in terms of policy formulation? Does it help in terms of strategy formulation and all that? So you need just to try to find a reason and try to present it that way. Furthermore, previous theoretical models need to embrace contemporary research in this, or you can also try to show the weaknesses of previous models and try to justify why we need new modeling around your field of study and all those kind of stuff. Try to write more about why the previous theory is not good enough. Why? Because it focused primarily on this and it didn't encompass this that you want to work on and all those kind of stuff. That will give you quite a strong theoretical gap. And when you write it like that, usually people, your audience, your examiners, your panelists, they won't struggle to know what exactly you are trying to deal with. So based on the review of prior research, now moving on to the population gap, based on the review of prior research, there is a population gap. Some of these subpopulations have been unexplored and under-researched, and you should have been able to identify, is it the age that is under-researched? Is it the gender? Which gender is it? Is it the ethnicity? With which ethnicity, which race is this? So there appears to be an important worth investigation in the context of and all those kind of stuff. Dr. Mary was talking about people learning, people staying in the rural or in the countryside. So if we are to look at research, most of the research that I have seen, especially with technology and online learning, is already favored more of the people with the developed infrastructure, which you find in urban spaces. What is the status of research around online learning in rural settings or in settings where infrastructure for learning online has not been properly been thought about and all those kind of stuff? That could be one way of putting a population gap into that, and it really requires investigation to find out how bad is the digital divide and all those kind of issues. So and you would now need to go on and try to justify, well, why is it important for you and me to do research on online learning, focusing on countryside population, focusing on rural population? Why is that important? Why is it important to investigate that particular group? And you can go on and say previous research has primarily focused on this, and it continues to consolidate your population gap argument. Very little research has been done on this and all those kind of stuff. In case you have something here.
Nothing really. You can proceed, Dr. Wong.
Okay, so in terms of how do we now find the research gaps, there is so much volume of research out there, and identifying these gaps can actually be overwhelming. It can actually be impossible. And for instance, if you are doing a COVID-19 research, you literally don't have time to read every paper published on COVID-19 and let's say online learning, because there are actually millions of papers out there. And out of the millions, you cannot read all of them. And I am saying this knowing very well that you also don't have time to read every paper. So how then do you identify a research gap? Maybe Dr. Mari can come through and talk to these ones, and then we move forward.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Woy. So how do we find research gaps? Essentially, we are saying that different techniques and strategies that can actually be used in different in various disciplines, but we can always reduce some of them to a few steps, which are the following. For example, identify your key motivating issue or your key research question. What is the key research question in your particular study? That is very important. Also, identify key terms associated with this issue. Also, instead of just having one term that you have other synonyms of that particular term, so that you can interchange that, you can interchangeably use these terms. For example, if I'm saying it's similar, what is the other word that is also means similar, or something like that, so that you can be able to associate that with the issue that you are trying to look at. But we are also saying, review the literature, searching for these key terms and identifying relevant publications. So it's very important that when you do your literature search, you are not just reading everything around that particular issue, but you are trying to zero it down to a specific research problem that you are trying to deal with, or a particular issue that you are trying to understand and try and investigate. Also, we are saying, review the literature cited by the key publications which you located in the step above. So if you have done a literature search, you have found literature, the most important issue is to make sure that you then come up with the list of key publications, which are the seminal papers, which are the key publications, which sources are always quoted by this, because you will see that there's a trend that tend to happen once you are reading the right kind of stuff. Some people tend to cite certain people because of their knowledge around that particular. So that allows you then to build that database of key publications that you need to consult, so that you can be able to make sense of whether you are going to be able to get that research gap based on reading of that literature. But the other issue we are saying, identify issues not addressed by the literature relating to your critical motivating issue. It's also very important. Don't focus on what is written, what is present. Also look at what is absent. What is it that they are not looking at? What is it? What is the blind spot of those kinds of publications? Where are they not focusing their attention? Once you can do that, then you can be able to develop that third eye that allows you to actually come up with what we call a research gap. Thanks, Dr. Woyo. You can take over.
Thank you, Dr. Mare, for that. So in terms of after discovering the research gap, so what is next? So once you have discovered your research gaps, it is actually critical that you prioritize. Which one do you really want to run with? We have presented you with quite a number of the gaps. So it's taxing to argue for all the 7 gaps in a single study. So you can actually prioritize which of these gaps are critical and which of these gaps do I need to run with. So you may find many questions which remains to be answered, and that's one way you're gonna organize your issues. So often one question must be answered before the next one can actually be addressed. So in your prioritization of the gaps, you should consider your funding agency, for instance. You should also consider the level you are doing. So if you are doing a master's, I'm sure just a theoretical gap or a practical gap will work. If you are doing a PhD, you might need to show maybe 2 or 3 or 4 of these gaps and see. And you also need to consider your audience. What are they looking for and what do they want to know about the issues you are doing? You also need to consider the needs of your field and the relevance of your questions to what is currently being studied. These are critical issues when trying to prioritize your study and all those kind of things. You also need to consider your own resources. We don't have a lot of time. Masters, you need to do it at most in a year or at minimum in 6 months and all those kind of stuff, the component of the thesis. So consider your own resources. If you put so many gaps in your studies, it also means you need so much money to do so many surveys, to do so much data collection and all those kind of stuff. And also consider your ability your ability to conduct the research you are considering. These are key issues that needs to be understood. So once you have done this, you'll be able to narrow your search your search to one particular research question and all those kind of stuff. So these are the issues that we felt we're going to share with you and maybe have a discussion in the next 30 minutes and see what are the issues that you might have. So that was all from us in answer session. I have just put one article of mine there. Maybe perhaps if you can read that and try to see what kind of gap did I present there. It's for you to just do your knowledge check and see. So it's that gap written down there in blue. Or highlighted in blue, where it starts by saying Namibia developed its ICT policy and all that kind of stuff. If you can figure out what gap did I present there. Anyone who figured out? Anyone who figured out? Nobody. Yes, you can go ahead, Jennifer. Your hand is raised.
I think it's the implementation of ICTs in higher and tertiary education.
Yeah, you are correct. But which particular gap does it adequately addresses? Is it a theoretical? Is it a population? Is it a practice? Is it an evidence gap and all those kind of stuff? Where do you place that?
Okay, sorry, let me go through and I'll come back to you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so maybe it's question time. Let's hear what your questions are, and then we take it.
Can I
Yes?
respond,
Yes,
Dr.
please.
Will?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm seeing something to do with maybe some perceptions could be to do with what? With knowledge and the targeting higher education students. Could that do with the population gap?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, it was a combination of the knowledge and the population gap that I wanted to argue for this paper, because this paper is all about ICT implementation. It was measuring the perceptions of higher education students. And what I was arguing for here was most of the literature on the policy, they have focused on secondary schools, which is a different population, leaving the population of university students largely unexplored. So there is that population gap. That was the argument of this paper and all those kind of stuff. So what we are saying is this kind of paragraph here should actually be appearing in your proposals, depending which gap you really want to run with, so that when I read this, I am totally convinced and I'm with you all the way to wherever you are going. So I think the questions could be running through there in the chat. Yeah, so Diana says the population gap, you are correct. Precious is asking an interesting point here. What is the difference between a research gap and population? Dr. Mari, difference between research gap and research problem?
Let me just come in. It depends. It depends. Some university wants to use the term research problem. Some would say, can you tell us what is your research gap or something like that? But pretty much it's pretty much the same thing, because what the two actual, or what the research gap and research problem it tries to do is is about justifying your research. Why should we do that research? Why is your research important? What is it that it is bringing to the table that is not on the table right now? That's essentially what you are trying to do. So you are justifying the need for your research, and that's why we call it a research gap. Most of the time we tend to use the term research gap because it's a gap that you are trying to fill. There is something that you are saying the glass is not full, but there is more water that I can actually pour on, and pouring that water into the glass that is the part of gap filling. When you do your study, you are pretty much doing what we call gap filling research in most cases.
Okay, thank you for that. So your research gap is the research problem that you would have discovered after doing your rigorous review, and then your problem statement should be is a constructed sentence of how do you describe your research problem, which is usually a subset of your research problem in other words. So I think like what Dr. Murray has said, I would agree with that and see. Any other issue? Okay, sorry, I was not checking. In which heading should I mention the research gap? In which heading should I mention the research gap?
For me, I would say you can demonstrate it if your template says research problem. When you talk about research problem, that's where where you should be able to demonstrate your research gap. If it doesn't say that again in that, you can also say it after doing your literature, a thorough literature review. Towards the end of your literature review, you must be able to say, I've reviewed all this literature, but it is very evident from the literature that I've reviewed that there is something that is missing from this literature that this study intends to do. And then by demonstrating that you are paving way for a situation when you come to your chapter 3 where you discuss about your findings, then you are now telling us, this is what I'm doing to be able to fill that gap that I have addressed, that I've raised through my literature review in chapter 2, for example. That's what you can do.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. You can also mention it, I think, in a number of areas. Even when you are writing your proposal, it should come also maybe in your background of the study. You trying to tell us what is it that we know and what is it that we don't know that we should know. And like in addition to what Dr. Murray has said, so you can also try to indicate it there. If you are writing a research article, it should immediately come through in your introduction section of it before we read everything else. We need to know what is the gap this particular study is presenting. Based on your experience from the presentations on Monday to Wednesday, what are the common mistakes that we as students make in identifying the gap? What's this name? Javera. Based on my experience, the problem is the people don't actually have the gaps. They are not able to present what is their research gap. So, and in the end, that's the reason why you find, if you cannot identify the gap, you cannot actually construct a problem statement and all those kind of stuff. So based on my experience, especially on the presentations of Monday to Wednesday, the common mistake is people are not able to sufficiently present what is their research gap all about. And as a result, they won't be in a position to make a meaningful presentation and defense of their work and all those kind of stuff. I don't know whether I've answered you, Njavera, or maybe Dr. Murray, you can also come through here and and explain what could be some of the common mistakes when students make when they're identifying their gap?
I would say that generally, besides just failing to demonstrate, clearly that you have got a research gap, there is always an assumption that, readers or your audience are going to just find it somewhere hidden, somewhere there. And I think you have to be very strategic and also very upfront about it to demonstrate to your reader that you know that research is about gap filling, and you must have the way how we're demonstrating using those statements that we gave you towards the end, where we are giving you how you can actually construct a sentence so that you justify that you are actually trying to fill a particular gap. So you must be very purposeful about it. You must be very clear in terms of how you are going to fill that particular gap, and how you have identified it and how it manifests itself. Does it manifest itself at the level of knowledge? Does it manifest itself at the level of population? If it does at the level of population, you have some statistics that shows that, after a thorough analysis of literature, this is what has been found in terms of research, that it tends to focus on a particular group of people. And therefore, it means there are certain people that are being left out of this particular group, which means there is a population gap that we are trying to deal with or to address. So it's very important that you clearly articulate what is it that we have seen after reading your literature, what is coming out that you want to purposefully deal with in your study, so that at the end of the day, somebody can actually benefit from it. Because people don't just read thesis, or you don't just read this dissertation for the sake of reading, but we want to find new knowledge, and we want to find something that is unique, that you are bringing to the table. So you must think about that every time you are writing your research proposal, or even you are writing your thesis. Am I doing enough in terms of raising awareness about my research gap or my research problem in this particular study?
In a sense of not getting any gap in my research, what must I do? Namboga, that is quite impossible. You should be able to get a gap, and if you don't get a gap, then that particular research is not worth doing. I don't know what, Dr. Mare, you're going to respond to this. In a sense of not getting any gap in my research, what must I do? I think you quit.
Yeah, you have to go back to the drawing board, because it means that the body still needs to be. You still need to do something on that board. It's still blank. You need to go back and read and identify what is it that is very peculiar about this study. What is it that I'm trying to do through this study? What is it that has motivated me to do this particular study? That should come out very clear.
I think I don't have any other questions here, so maybe people are fine. Are there any other questions that we might entertain and try to answer? Okay, let me just check if YouTube has got any issues. YouTube participants, let me quickly check that. Okay, so it looks like today it's not difficult. People don't have so many issues. So I think we're gonna end here. Maybe Dr. Murray, you can give us some closing remarks.
Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Woyo, for this session. Certainly, I think we have tried to deal with some of the nagging issues that were not probably addressed in our initial webinar on this particular topic. But I think this platform that we had today certainly has gone a long way in trying to give our participants a wider range of choice in terms of what are the types of research gaps that you can actually be able to identify without just saying, I'm trying to fill this particular gap. Now you have got so many other, modules that you can use. You can say, I'm focusing on the population, I'm focusing on the empirical, is it the methodological, is it the practical knowledge, is it about evidence? It's now up to you to see what suits your study and what is it that is coming out from your literature review. So it's very important from now on to go back to the drawing board if you were struggling to get one research gap and see what the literature is saying. What is it that what is it that is saying and what is it that is not saying? So when you are reading, it's always very important. Don't just focus on what is on the paper. Also think about what is this paper not talking about, which is very important to that particular area. That will allow you to develop what we call the third sense or the third eye in terms of understanding what a research gap could be or is in your particular field. Thank you so much.
So thank you everyone for joining in. We meet again next week, unless, did I see some? Yeah, we meet again next week for some discussion. We hope your writing is going to be better. So it's bye-bye for now until we meet again next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Prof,
Yes?
I just wanted to ask, does this happen every week or how does it go? Because I only found out about this 2 days ago when a classmate sent me the link. So does this happen once a week or how does it, the session
Yeah,
that they're having now?
we are doing these sessions every Friday until end of November.
Oh, okay. I didn't know because I've been struggling a bit now with what you just explained now. I think I have a better understanding now.